Okay, so today is April 9th, 2016. Okay, so let us begin with the homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato Sama Sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato Sama Sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato Sama Sambuddhassa. Okay, good morning, everybody. Okay, I'll stand. So today we will be taking Sutta number 148 in the middle-length discourses. So you can see we're really pulling into the Grand Central Station now, coming to the end of our journey. Okay, so this sutta is called the Chachaka Sutta, which means the 6 sets of 6. In the Pali language, the word cha means 6, and then when you add a ka to the end of a number, it means a group of that number. So Panchaka, what is Panchaka? Right, it's a group of 5. So sometimes the commentaries will speak about the Kanda Panchaka. Instead of saying the Panchakanda, the 5 aggregates, it'll be the Kanda Panchaka, the group of 5 aggregates. Chatuka is what? Right. Group. Did you say that, Bob?
No.
Oh. It's a group of 4. Tika is what? Group of 3. Right. Even we almost have something like that in English? Troika? Okay, so this is, the cha is 6, and chaka is a group of 6. And why the sutta has that title, that we will see as we go into it. Okay, the Buddha opens the sutta in a rather unusual way. Usually he'll just address the bhikkhus and say, "Oh monks," then he'll say, "I'm going to teach you this," or "I'm going to teach you that." But here I think he wants to emphasize the importance of this discourse by using this opening declaration. So he says, "Bhikkhus, the monks, I shall teach you the Dhamma that is good in the beginning, good in the middle, and good in the end, with the right meaning and the right phrasing. I shall reveal a holy life that is utterly perfect and pure." So this is the way in many other discourses when the passage is introducing how the Buddha appears in the world, then it will use this formula to describe how he presents his teaching. But here the Buddha himself is using it to describe the teaching that he's going to give in the sutta. So this, as I said before, it sort of highlights or underscores the importance and the value of the sutta. And so he says, "I shall reveal a holy life or spiritual life that is utterly perfect and pure, And then he identifies what that particular Dhamma is that he's going to be teaching. And that is the 6 sets of 6, the Chachaka. Okay, so he begins, as he often does, first with the kind of what I call the synopsis, just like the table of contents of what he's going to expound. So he says the 6 internal sense bases should be understood, the 6 external sense bases, the 6 classes or types of consciousness, the 6 types of contact, the 6 types of feeling, the 6 classes or types of craving should be understood. Okay, so that is the outline, the summary of the presentation. And now comes the udesa, the nidesa, or vibhanga, the analysis of the outline. So he says, and a lot of these items are going to be familiar to us already because we've come across them in the last few suttas. So he says the 6 internal bases should be understood. So what is the meaning of this? Then he explains that there are these 6 internal sense bases: the eye base, ear base, nose base, tongue base, body base, and mind base. So these are sometimes called the 6 internal sense bases, or the 6 sense faculties. Strictly speaking, they're not exactly identical with the gross sense organ, but rather, for example, what is called the eye base is not the eye that you see when you look in the mirror, but it's a sensitive type of material substance located within the eye that is receptive to light and colors and forms and shapes. In other words, in modern terms, we might think of it as the rods and cones. Any ophthalmologists in the room? Good, I don't have to be rigorously scientific. Okay, so the eye base is this subtle substance located within the eye that is sensitive to colors, lights, forms, shapes. The ear base, again, is not this floppy thing, these that are out here, but located within the inner ear. There's a kind of substance that is sensitive to sounds. The nose base is a kind of subtle substance. It's not this protuberance out here, but somewhere deep up here there's a kind of subtle substance which is sensitive to odors and fragrances. That is the nose base. And the tongue base, again, it's a substance located on the tongue, maybe the taste buds we would call them, which are receptive to flavors. The body base, it's something which is spread out over the body, which is sensitive to tactile sensations. And the mind base is not the brain, it's not a physical organ, but we could think of it as the organ of thought, conceptualization, judgments, assessments, conceptual formulations, and so on. Okay, so these are the 6 internal sense bases, and then their counterparts are the 6 external bases, or the 6 types of objects that correspond to the 6 internal sense bases. So we have visible forms correspond to the eye, sounds to the ear, odors to the nose, flavors to the tongue. Textures to the body. Wow, that's a good word. I've always been using tangible objects, tactile objects. Textures is a very good, simple word. And then corresponding to the mind base, there is the class of mental objects. You call these concepts, ideas, thoughts, emotions, reflections, everything that takes place internally in the processing of information is the object of the mind base. Okay, then we come to the 6 classes of consciousness. And it's interesting the way the sutta is laying this, the Buddha is laying this out in the sutta. Instead of just enumerating the 6 types of consciousness, he shows how each type of consciousness arises in dependence upon a particular internal sense base and a particular external sense base. So this is why we call these sense bases, or to use the Pali word, ayatana. They're ayatanas because they are the bases for consciousness. And so here the sutta says that dependent upon the I and forms, I consciousness arises. So the I and the forms are conditions for the arising of I consciousness. The function of I consciousness is to perceive or to cognize visible forms. And in order to cognize visible forms, I consciousness by itself is helpless. In order to cognize forms, it needs to stand upon a base. And that base is the I, the sensitive I. And the I and forms are both conditions for I consciousness, but they are conditions in different ways. Does anybody remember our Abhidhamma retreat last year? We spoke about conditional relations. Okay, the visible forms are a condition for I consciousness. As what kind of condition? No.
Contact.
I think I heard it in the back.
Contact.
Say again.
Contact.
Contact? No. Again? Try again. Come on. At least one person has to say it, otherwise I dismiss the class.
You state the question about that?
In what way are the visible forms a condition for I consciousness? Amongst the different conditions that we mentioned, that I mentioned in the Abhidhamma retreat. Boy. Speak up.
It's so dangerous. It's just condition.
Condition? What kind of condition?
Dependent?
Dependence is just another word for condition. Not quite. We need once. We have to know the 24 conditions.
Volition.
No. Okay.
Mentality and materiality.
Mentality, materiality. Not quite. There's a very specific type of condition. Come on, Bowie. Okay, there it is. You're saved. It's object condition. The I is a condition for consciousness in what way? Again, very specific word.
Sense.
Vision or
No. Particular type of condition.
Light.
No.
I is a root condition.
Root condition? No. I give you a hint. A professor at a university is a member of what?
Faculty.
Okay. Now it's coming left and right. The faculty condition. So, visible forms are the object condition. The I is the faculty condition. It's also the support condition, various other types of conditions. But the most important one, the most obvious one, is that it's the faculty condition. So we have the 6 external bases are the 6 objects, the 6 internal bases are the 6 faculties. And then in dependence on object and faculty, the respective type of consciousness arises. But as I've explained a number of times in the past, in the case of mind consciousness, it gets a little different because each of the 5 types of sense consciousness can have only one object. The I consciousness, you can be playing the most beautiful Mozart concertos. The I consciousness, unless it looks at the score or the record label, it has no idea what's going on. Nose consciousness can't smell the concerto. Tongue consciousness can't taste it. Only the ear consciousness can hear it. But in the case of the mind consciousness, that can take all objects as its domain. So the I consciousness, the mind consciousness takes the visible forms as its domain. So the way I recognize, Barbara's jacket and CU's, we call this this sweatshirt, as both being blue. Okay, what identifies the same color, it's mind consciousness. The I consciousness just takes in the impression of the color, but the mind consciousness distinguishes, they're both blue. Or is that really blue or
Green.
yeah. Well, excuse me. Anyways, again, it's the mind consciousness that looked more closely and saw green, not quite blue. Okay, so mind consciousness does a lot of work. It turns the whole visual field into something that's meaningful. The I consciousness is just like, in a way you say it's stupid like a camera. The camera can take in the most beautiful scenes, but the camera has no idea what it's photographing. But it's when we look at the picture, that is when we say, that's a beautiful photograph of the lake at Huangyan Monastery. That's a photograph of a group of school children playing baseball. That's a photograph of of my college graduating class. Okay, so the mind consciousness turns all of these sensory domains into whatever we call spheres of meaning, spheres of significance. When we listen to a piece of music, just the ear consciousness just picks up the sounds, the notes, but it has no idea what these notes signify. But the mind consciousness sort of merges one note to the next and distinguishes, that's the Mozart concerto. That's the Rolling Stones. That's about the peak limit of where my knowledge of pop music ends. And they're a couple of years older than I am. Who are the latest? Taylor Swift? Beyonce. Okay, so ear consciousness distinguishes that. Tongue consciousness, we could eat anything, but we don't know whether it's an Indian curry, Chinese tofu dish, Italian pizza. Tongue consciousness will take in all of the taste, but it can't identify. But it's the mind consciousness that identifies. Okay, so now we've come through the 18, what are called the 18 elements. And now we're going to go further. And it's interesting the way the Buddha sort of takes this in a sequence, not just laying out the different classes, but he builds up in a sequence. And at the end, we'll see where the sequence has been heading. So he comes in with next, the 6 classes of contact should be understood. So now we come to contact. And contact means, the way it's expressed in the text often, it's said to be the coming together of 3 things, of the object, the sense faculty, and consciousness. So it said, Tinang Sangati Paso Vuchati. So the meeting of the 3 is called contact. But the way I understand contact, not simply the meeting of the 3, but the meeting takes place in a particular way. The way I see it is that it's consciousness meeting the object through the sense faculty, or the sense object encountering consciousness through the sense faculty. So the sense faculty is the door. Sometimes they're called the doors, the 6 sense doors. The doors through which mind or consciousness is able to meet the object. So we bring in the object through the door and say, visible form, meet eye consciousness. Eye consciousness, meet form. They shake hands, and that's contact. Sound comes in through the ear, so we say, ear consciousness, meet the sound. Sound, meet the ear consciousness. They shake hands, and that's contact. And so here we could see the way the Buddha lays this out in a kind of evolving sequence. Dependent on the eye and forms, eye consciousness arises. The meeting of the 3 is contact. Then dependent on the ear and sounds, and so on, so on. dependent on the mind and mind objects. Mind consciousness arises. The meeting of the three is contact. Okay, so it was reference to this that it was said the 6 classes of consciousness should be understood. So that's the 4th chakra, the 4th set of 6. Now we come to the 5th, and this is the feeling. Because feeling arises dependent on contact. Whenever consciousness encounters any object through any sense faculty, along with that contact, a feeling arises. Often the feeling is very subtle, very fleeting, so that we're hardly even aware of it. You know, as I've been speaking here, you ask me, what are you feeling? Pleasure, pain? No, I'm not even aware because my mind is completely engaged in speaking. But even while I'm speaking, every moment there's a feeling, sometimes a little pleasure, sometimes a little pain, sometimes just a neutral feeling. And so these feelings are always occurring. Because every moment there's a new contact taking place and a new feeling that arises dependent on that contact. And so one of the things that happens as one develops the practice of mindfulness meditation is that one starts to become aware of the feelings arising at, I call, subtler and subtler levels. And so where it seems that we're normally just passing through a phase of just bland, neutral experience, but by attending mindfully and very attentively, one could see a moment of pleasure, a moment of joy, a moment of pain. And then as maybe if one is sitting for a long time and the pain starts to increase in the legs or the back, and then if one starts to attend even closely to that pain, one sees that it's not a solid mass, but just a succession of moments of pain arising and passing, dependent upon particular types of contact. Okay, and then through each of the sense bases, dependent with contact as condition, there is feeling. And so we have feeling arisen through eye contact, feeling arisen through ear contact, and so on, till we have feeling arisen through mind contact. So that's the 5th set of 6. Then we come to the 6th set of 6, and that is the 6 classes of craving. And so here the text pulls in, it doesn't just enumerate the 6 types of craving, but it pulls in everything that has come before. Ooh. It's just that my recorder I saw ran out of power, but fortunately another one. Okay, so now we have the 6 classes of craving again, which is, they're not simply enumerated, but they're brought in at the end of the series of terms. So we have dependent on the I and forms, I consciousness arises. The meeting of the 3 is contact. With contact as condition, there is feeling. With feeling as condition, there is craving. Does this remind anybody of anything that they might have seen previously?
Origination?
Yeah, exactly. So we have here a kind of segment or sector from the formula, the 12-factor formula of Paticca Samuppada, dependent origination. But instead of starting from ignorance up through contact. It starts from immediate sense experience, seeing a form with the eye, the contact takes place, the feeling takes place, and conditioned by that feeling, craving arises. And we know that from the Four Noble Truths that craving is the origin of dukkha, of suffering. Okay, so this pattern is played out according to all of the six sense bases. And so we have 6 types of craving. And that is the 6th set of 6. Okay, at this point I'll ask whether there's any questions. And please keep the questions, tied to the subject, closely to the subject matter. Alvena, did you want to ask? Or maybe since Edwin is closer, you take it.
Can you explain a little more the contact, mind contact? I understand it, just can't put it together when it comes to the mind contact with all 3 sense.
Yeah,
external consciousness and mind contact.
Yeah, it's somewhat tricky. Let me just see if I can figure it out. Because it seems, in the case of a visible form, it's pretty evident that the form comes into range of the eye, and then when there's consciousness of it, then there's a contact. But with mental objects, it's hard to see how they could come into range unless the contact has already taken place. I don't have an easy answer for
It's
that.
hard for me to put it together. I just couldn't really analyze it the way.
The only thing I can speculate is that maybe at a subliminal level, objects are constantly flowing through the stream of consciousness, and only on occasion the mind faculty will pick up, and then it comes into as a clear and distinct object of consciousness.
Bhante, it seems like consciousness is used interchangeably with cognition here, because it's not the consciousness that we usually think of. Right? We're looking at feeling, which is coming after consciousness, and craving, which is coming even after that.
I see. So you're saying that the word that's translated as consciousness is used somewhat in the sense of cognition. Yeah, I would agree with that. But how would you distinguish consciousness and cognition?
Well, when you talk about in layman's terms, when you say higher consciousness, you are assuming it is beyond feeling and craving. So I'm just comparing it from, that perspective.
I don't think let's not bring higher consciousness in, but ordinary consciousness. But just ordinarily, we use the word consciousness, we think, is one conscious, or if one is asleep or has fainted, he's unconscious.
Right.
So consciousness is just taken as kind of general state of awareness. But here, as you say, it's closer to a particular cognition, an act of knowing or experiencing. In that sense, you're right.
And one thing, your experience, like the first 3 sets of 6s are distinct. They are all 3. They're 6, like I as an object, external, internal, and it has a consciousness.
Yeah.
But when you move to the next 3 sets of 6s, they are basically bringing all of them together. Contact comes together when all 3 come together, and then feeling. So they're not. And this I'm just asking because people may have had experience, or you had experience. Is there a distinction between feeling associated with just the I, external, internal, and consciousness? Or is it just one feeling?
I'm not quite sure I get the
So
question.
there are no 6 feelings. Basically, there are no 6 feelings. There's just one feeling.
No, there's 6 kinds, or at least the text distinguishes 6 kinds of feelings based upon the type of contact through which it arises, and the contact is determined by the distinction of the 6 sense faculties.
So craving also, you would
Yeah.
say, would be, okay, because I don't know, in one's personal experience, one would say that feeling is just feeling. It may have nothing to do with either just seeing or either just, taste or either just hearing.
But I think if you reflect, you could see that feelings are distinguishable according to the sense domain through which they arise. If I see a visible form, it might give rise to feeling of pleasure, feeling of pain, or just a neutral feeling. What is true is that these 3 ways of distinguishing feeling, pleasant, painful, neutral, operate through all 6 senses. Yeah. So you could say whatever the sense faculty through which feeling arises, we could put that distinction aside and say we just have to look at feeling from the standpoint of pleasant, painful, neutral. But the text sometimes will break up the feeling according to the sense domain, and then within each there are these 3 types of feelings. So in that way you get 18 types, 3 types through each of the 6 senses, 18 feelings. And Sarah, yeah.
The question is on craving. Craving here, does it mean also craving for wanting and craving for not wanting?
Say again?
Craving here, does it mean also, normally when we say craving, we assume it with some pleasurable things, experiences. Does it also here mean craving for not wanting undesirable situations or experiences?
Oh, I see. Okay, I see. The craving to avoid what's painful or undesirable. Is that what you're looking for?
Yes, Bhante.
It could include that. The text itself doesn't go into an analysis of craving here. It just speaks of craving. But usually when the texts speak about the objects of craving, they speak about craving for... Well, actually here it speaks about craving for the 6 sense objects. So this would be probably the craving to enjoy and to get possession of the 6 sense objects. But we could also see that, on reflection, say that there is the craving to avoid what is unpleasant.
Thank you.
Bhante,
Okay, please.
Bhante, are you hearing me?
Yeah.
Oh, you talked about the internal sense basis and the external. I never got the external.
You didn't get the external sense basis?
No, I never got it.
Yeah, those are the 6 sense objects. Eyes, ears, nose, tongue, visible forms, sounds, odors, tastes, textures, and mental objects.
Oh, those are these external sense base?
Yeah.
I thought you said that the eye has a subtle substance. That's the internal.
Those are the internal sense bases.
I thought the external would be like the earlobe.
No. The external sense bases are the objects of the 6 sense faculties.
I got that, but I wasn't sure. I had to contemplate it.
Yeah. And you're Giovanna, is it correct? Anna, I'm sorry. Okay. Oh, somebody else? Stace?
Hi, Bhante. I don't remember if the sutta gets into how to practice these things, but in terms of sati, how do we use mindfulness and the 6 sense bases?
I'm trying to think whether the sutta goes into. I think the sutta doesn't go into that, and that's a rather big question. So let's put it aside. Maybe at the end or in the discussion period we could take that up. Because I don't want to go into big areas now, but just questions that come up directly, based on what I said. Or questions for clarifications.
Yeah, I had a clarification about feeling.
Yeah.
So, as feeling pertains to, let's say, body contact. So if you brush up against a rope, the contact then produces a feeling that's purely tactile.
Yeah.
But there might also be an accompanying feeling of the mind saying, "Oh, I think that's a snake."
I see.
Is those two different kinds of feelings that can be produced by the same contact?
Okay, you brush up, say, against a piece of cloth. Okay, so now first there's a tactile sensation, and that will give, maybe it's a pleasant feeling.
Well, I mean, a feeling of just, so it's just purely tactile, tactile recognition.
Yeah.
There's no feeling involved. That's still at the level of contact?
No, even when that cloth brushes up against the arm, there is a contact, which is this would be body contact, and there'll be a feeling that arises conditioned by that contact. There is a feeling there. Okay, then the mind might recognize that contact and not thinking anything about the object. It might feel if it's like a silky feeling, it might be smooth, a smooth feeling. So then it might be a pleasant feeling. Mm-hmm. So this is a pleasant feeling based upon body contact.
But the mind has come into play there.
Okay, the mind comes into play, and it'll also pick up on that contact and maybe enjoy it because it's a pleasant feeling. But then suddenly it gets the thought, this is a snake. Okay, and then fear arises and aversion towards that touch.
And that's craving.
Let's not bring craving in here. Just say that there's, because I want to come to your question. So there's this, there's the contact, fear, aversion arises, and accompanying that fear and aversion, there'll be an unpleasant feeling. That unpleasant feeling, it's based upon the cognition, that's a snake, and then it's based upon the fear and aversion. But it's not, that feeling is not directly arising from the touch sensation. The touch sensation is just a touch sensation which brings up its feeling, which will be a pleasant feeling if it's a smooth, silky piece of cloth.
So I guess my question is that going back to the sensation that would be pleasant or neutral or would be disagreeable if the fabric is rough, the mind is involved making a judgment there, isn't that? I mean, so what is the feeling that has to do directly with the sense person?
The feeling that arises directly from the touch sensation is occurring at a what we call very primitive or primordial stage, or fundamental stage in the development of the conscious process. This is before any kind of recognition takes place. It's just the sensation, and a feeling arises based on that sensation. But then when cognitions or identifications take place, that is where new feelings enter based upon, to the kind of identification or cognition that takes place. If one recognizes, it's a nice piece of silky cloth, then there'll be continued enjoyment of the pleasant sensation. If suddenly one thinks, that's a snake, then there's fear arises, and then there's unpleasant feeling, which is conditioned by the fear, and that fear is conditioned by the wrong cognition. But that unpleasant feeling is not directly based on the touch sensation of the cloth. If it's a rough piece of cloth, then a painful bodily feeling will arise. But if it's a doctor is giving one injection to get rid of the illness, then there's a painful feeling, but one recognizes that he's injecting medicine that's going to help me get over this illness, so then there'll be a pleasant mental feeling. Okay, one more quick question. You used to come here a long time ago, didn't you?
Bhante, I have a question regarding following her question and your explanation. You talk about if I touch strictly touch the contact of the cloth, is pleasant and unpleasant, pure of that.
Yeah.
But you're talking about the fear and the the
aversion,
object of a snake. I thought that is our mind is already goes through several layers of process.
Yeah.
Because the first you have feelings, contact with the blanket, and then you create the craving, and then you start another process to it creates the mind, and the mind object. The object is we created the fear. The fear and the snake is beyond the first direct contact. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct, yeah.
Okay. That's what I want to clarify. Thank you.
Okay, is it a simple question?
It's actually not a question.
Oh, okay.
It's more an experience as I'm sitting here, and I think that we meditate for 50 minutes. What we need to do is remain in that meditation mode of observance. Because we're sitting here trying to understand intellectually alone, that's not going to work. Because the Buddha didn't read books. He saw this in meditation. So all of this will come together. Take it in intellectually, but don't. And then meditate, and you will see.
This will becomes clear through meditation. Okay, but let us move on now. Okay, now we come to the next section of the discourse, and this is a very important section. And this is what I gave it the title called The Demonstration of Not Self. So this is one of what I find to be one of the clearest arguments, you could say, in the Buddha's discourses on one of the clearest arguments for the principle of non-self. And it's also one of the clearest expositions, I would say, of what is the meaning of anatta, of non-self. Because often in popular books, not only popular books, but even sometimes learned, scholarly books on Buddhism, it said that the Buddha teaches that there is no self. And I don't like to formulate the doctrine of anatta, non-self, in that way. Because it could lead to misunderstanding. Like if you say that you don't have a self, what have I been doing the last 35 years or so? Here I was, I've gone through 70-something years of life, and suddenly I'm told that self doesn't exist. Complete puzzlement. Rather, what I say is that what the Buddha speaks often, he'll actually use the word self in a positive way. And so what I've been able to see, I haven't really investigated this at length from the discourses, from the suttas, but there are, I say, two domains of discourse in the Buddha's teachings. One domain we'll call the ethical domain, and the other we call the contemplative or philosophical domain. When the Buddha is speaking within the ethical domain, he'll use the word self positively. For example, he'll say, it's by yourself that evil is done. by yourself that good is done. You yourself must make an effort. No one can purify another. Or you yourself know whether you have been acting properly or improperly. Or he'll say that it's the self that has to be understood. You have to understand yourself. So in all those types of expressions, we see that the Buddha is using the word self in order to inculcate personal responsibility. Again, we have the famous discourse, part of the, actually it comes in the Parinibbana Sutta, where the Buddha says, be an island unto yourself, be a refuge for yourself, don't depend on any external refuge. So again, in this situation, in order to stress the importance of personal responsibility for one's behavior, for one's mental development, the Buddha will use the word self in a positive, affirmative way. But this doesn't mean that he's affirming the existence of what we would call the substantial metaphysical self. So what the Buddha is rejecting by the teaching of non-self is the reality of a substantial, permanent or persistent core of personal identity. A substantial, persistent core of personal identity. And the way the mind works, the approach the Buddha is taking is to take first the whole domain of experience, which is distinguished into these 6 sixes. And whenever anybody comes up with the idea that I have a self, that there is some reality, substantial reality to this sense of I, they will, when they're seeking to give some content to that sense of I, the sense I am, they'll identify it with some concrete element within experience. And when they identify the sense I am with some factor of experience, then that factor of experience is what is identified as the self, myself, what I really am. So maybe we could illustrate it this way. Okay, so here we have the ordinary person. Have I discovered a new talent? Okay, the ordinary person who has this idea that arises just sort of naturally in the back of the mind that I am. Always we're thinking, I do, I speak, I do this, I do that, I have such qualities, I'm a man, I'm a woman, I'm a monk, I'm a layperson, I'm Chinese, Korean, Caucasian, African, American, Hispanic, whatever. But always what lies behind all of these identifications, I am. And then sometimes one starts to ponder, what am I really? What is this I that's always appearing? And then when one starts reflecting, one identifies that I with something. Usually the Buddha will use the scheme of the 5 aggregates. I am bodily form, or feeling, or perception, or mental formations, or consciousness. Other times he'll use the 18 elements, the 6 internal sense bases, the 6 external bases, the 6 types of consciousness, and here he uses the 6 senses. So I identify something, this is what I really am. And that becomes the idea of myself, the true self. So it could be identified directly with any of these elements, or just considered as something in the background, the self that possesses all of these factors. But there's some idea of the self which is now crystallized through identification. And now for the Buddha, that is sort of the source of the problem, that identification of something with myself. And so to open the door to liberation, what the Buddha has to do is to break that identification. And the way he breaks that identification usually is just with a simple exposition that the 5 aggregates or the 6 sense bases are not mine, not I, not myself. But here, in this sutta, he uses a very systematic method of argument. It's almost, you could say, like a precursor, a forerunner of the kind of arguments that one finds in maybe later Buddhist philosophy, like Nagarjuna, the founder of the Madhyamaka school, where you take a position, then take another position that you hold. When you're arguing with somebody, you take a position that he holds, that he'll affirm, then you take another position that he'll affirm, and then show that the 2 positions that he's holding to are contradictory, so one has to go. And so in this case, we could run through the passage. This is on section number 10. So, suppose someone says, the I is the self. And so the Buddha says, that is not tenable. That's not valid. That's not acceptable. Okay, now he gives the reason. The rise and fall of the I are discerned. Okay, this is what one can detect. I mean, it's rather difficult to detect this in ordinary meditation, but when the meditation builds up intensity, then one can experience the constant arising and passing away, even of the sense faculties, the sense bases. But usually, what we experience arising and passing away would be more clearly the objects or the feelings. But let's just continue with the I. Okay, so the rise and fall of the I are discerned. So we think of the I as being the stable or persisting entity, but when one pays close contemplative attention to the I, one sees the I is constantly arising and passing away. And so what we normally call the I is really a series of events, not a stable entity, but a series of I events arising and passing away. Trying to think of a good analogy for this. Like one analogy that comes to mind is a stream in which the water is constantly changing, but that's not as good analogy as... Maybe a good analogy would be...
The weather's changing, right? I mean, it's not a weather. It's changing all the time.
Yeah, but I want something which changes not continuously, but in discrete...
Movie, film strip.
Oh, that's it, exactly, that's it. It's... I don't know whether they make movies in this way anymore. With the film, the strip of film, which turns around... Yeah, so you have distinct frames which are passing by so quickly that it looks like the person is there, maybe extending his arm or reaching for his gun, pull out and shoot. It's a gangster movie or a romance. But then if you look at the film strip, it's just, or if you slow down the projector, then it turns into distinct frames. Or even like the comic strip, the Mickey Mouse comics, they're just distinct. Each one is drawn differently. But the little difference, so when you run them by very quickly, it looks like Mickey Mouse is rowing a boat or whatever. Okay, so with the I, it's similar. It's momentary frames of the I arising, passing away, arising and passing away. Okay, now the person that the Buddha is speaking to would have to affirm that the I is arising and passing away. That's clearly discerned. Okay, and now, but the person wants to say the I is myself. But now what the Buddha says, since the rise and fall of the I are discerned, if you say the I is self, it would follow my self rises and falls away. And that is why it is not tenable, not justifiable, not reasonable for anyone to maintain the I is the self. And thus the conclusion follows, the I is not self. Okay, let's unpack this here. Because from the argument we could see what is the essential quality of the self that the Buddha is arguing against, and why he frames his teaching in this particular way. From the fact that the idea of self and the idea of arising and passing away are incompatible, we can see that what underlies this concept of self that the Buddha is rejecting is permanence or persistence. That is, the idea of self as being rejected, it's not what we call the everyday personality. It's not our everyday sense of personal identity. It's not the empirical personality or the empirical person, but it's the notion of a persistent, substantial core of personal identity. And if there were a substantial core of personal identity, it would have to persist either permanently from life to life, like the Atman of the Brahminic systems, or it would be a self that persists through the course of life and then is annihilated at death. But what the Buddha teaches is that all of these factors of experience arise and pass away, and therefore they cannot be identified as the self in the metaphysical sense. But it's not just the rejection of a metaphysical idea, because, nowadays, how many people subscribe to the metaphysical idea of a metaphysical self? You would have to go to maybe the graduate students at the philosophy departments at Yale, Harvard, Columbia, Cornell, ask them, do you believe in a metaphysical self? Probably 0.001% would say yes. But what I would say is that it's what takes place at a deep level of our ordinary mind is that we identify these factors of experience as being mine, I, or myself. And because we identify them as myself, then there sets in the clinging to them. And it's that clinging to them that for the Buddha maintains the cycle of birth and death, samsara. And so what has to be eliminated is the clinging to the idea of the self, the clinging to the factors of experience identified as being myself, the self. But I should also add that in the Buddha's time, I'm saying today, not many people might subscribe to the idea of a permanent self. But in the Buddha's time in India, in the 5th century, this was the big topic of discussion amongst the philosophers and ascetics. What is the real self? What is the true, everlasting self? And so they came up with many different theories, philosophies, systems, and at the core of all of these systems, like the sun at the center of the solar system, was the idea of the self. And what the Buddha did was to sort of turn this whole mode of speculation on his head by saying that you guys are all wrong, that this idea of self is just a fantasy, a delusion, a projection of the mind. And by doing that, he affected what you might call the Copernican revolution in Indian philosophy. And it seems that idea that there must be a self, it's still quite widespread in the Indian mind. Maybe not among some of the newly educated class, but I remember back in 1975, I was living in India at a Buddhist monastery there, and I went out, and somebody saw me and identified me as a Buddhist monk, and he came up very anxious. Is it true that you Buddhists don't accept the idea of the Atman? The real self? And I said, yes. And he was really worried and agitated. Then what about myself? What about myself? And we were standing, if I remember correctly, right outside the Bangalore mental hospital. I thought, I have to be be careful. As if I undermine this person's real strong attachment to a belief in self, he might wind up there. Okay, so the Buddha uses his argument first with the six, but actually he goes taking each domain of experience. So first the eye, then forms, eye consciousness, eye contact, then feeling, then craving, the craving based on the visual experience. So all of this he uses the same argument. Therefore, it is not valid, not tenable to say this is the self. And then he repeats the same argument with the domain of the ear, sounds, nose, odors. The ear, sound, nose, odors, tongue, flavors. Then goes to the body, tangibles, mind objects, till we come through all of these sixes, and the same argument applies that if you say, this is myself, then you also admit that this so-called self arises and passes away, then you'll find yourself stuck with the conclusion, myself arises and passes away. But you want to maintain, or we share the assumption that the self is something persistent or permanent. And if you say the self is persistent and permanent, and yet you say that the thing identified as self arises and passes away, then you get yourself locked into a self-contradiction. The only way to escape that self-contradiction is to drop the identification of this is myself and recognize this is not the self. Let's see if we can represent this schematically. Okay, so I put in brackets what I call the premise that's shared both by the Buddha and by the person that he's arguing with or discussing with. The premise is that the self, the idea of self, includes the idea or implies the idea of persistence or permanence. So if there is anything that's truly the self, it must be persistent or permanent. Okay, so the opponent says X is the self. Could be any of the 5 aggregates, it could be any of the 6 sense bases, or so on. Okay, so the Buddha then replies, look at what you identify as self. We're calling X. This arises and passes away. Okay, from that, it would then follow, if you say X is the self, it follows that the self arises and passes away. But the self must be persistent, permanent, which means it doesn't arise and pass away. So therefore, what you are identifying as self is actually not self. Does that seem to work? And one thing that we have to be careful, this was like an early generation of maybe European and some English interpreters of Buddhism back in the early 20th century would say, the Buddha was trying to point in the same direction as the thinkers of the Vedanta or the Upanishads to affirm the self, but in a negative way, to say that all of these things are not self, because the true self is what stands behind all of this, permanent, everlasting, indescribable, inconceivable.
One might mistakenly understand Nibbana as that.
Yeah, mistakenly, yeah. But the Buddha never speaks about the self in that way at all, and never gives any indication that he's pointing to a kind of permanent, everlasting self. He does speak about, usually he uses the word unconditioned, deathless, ageless, changeless, imperishable state, reality, condition, which is Nibbana. But he never speaks about that as the self or the true self. Because in the Buddha's sort of domain of discourse, whatever the idea of self already includes a kind of inherent clinging or grasping, a quest a quest for some kind of identity. And so the Buddha doesn't affirm the idea of self, even this kind of metaphysical, indescribable, inconceivable self. But he approaches realization through the investigation of the nature of phenomena, to see them all as being non-self, and thereby breaking the identification with them. I'll call this appropriation, which means taking possession, claiming this is mine, and identification, thinking this is what I am. And so by showing that these things are not self, not to be identified as self, he breaks the identification and breaks the appropriation, the possession. And that is what leads to realization and release.
Yeah, I have a question.
Okay. Yeah. Maybe take the mobile microphone.
Everything rises and passes, we understand that, but the Buddhist believes that maybe comes in line, and there's no more coming or going. What state is it in? Is it a permanent state of nirvana Because if you permanent, then there's a self. So now you're stating that if you everything passes, there's no substance, everything passes.
Yeah.
Rising and passes. So becoming enlightened, it is a form of permanence.
A form of
permanence. Isn't it permanent becoming enlightened? Nirvana?
Nirvana.
It's coming and going, so.
Yeah, nirvana itself, nibbana, is permanent, without coming, without going. But enlightenment, becoming enlightened, is itself an event. It's a conditioned event. It's an event that takes place, in the case of the Buddha, on a particular night under the Bodhi tree. So, the event took place, and it came to an end. But the Buddha's state of enlightenment, it lasted through his life, but it's not.
So X is not always not self in the state of enlightenment.
Let us say that the Buddha's experience, even as an enlightened one, is still made up of 5 aggregates. So he has bodily form, feelings, perceptions, mental activities, consciousness. Those 5 aggregates are always arising and passing away, so they are not self. But the Buddha underwent a certain transformation, so that transformation is irreversible, but it's not a permanent entity that remains. It's not a permanent entity that could be identified as self, but it's rather a transformed condition which persists through the changing of the 5 aggregates. I don't know.
But then again, if it says a God is permanent, then we know that is, based on the Buddhist terms, there's no such thing as a permanent God. They all, there's no self thing, there's none.
Yeah.
But by becoming enlightened, you're saying that that stops. It's no longer rising and passing.
No, as long as the enlightened person is alive, the experience is always arising and passing away.
Right. But in the state of already enlightenment, when it's already enlightened and moves on after death.
Yeah. Yeah, that becomes a permanent state, but there's no 5 aggregates are not there. Yeah. Okay, Anna had a question. Then we'll have to break for the lunch, but we come back.
So this holds if the premise is that the self has to be persistent and permanent.
Yeah.
Is there a way of conceiving of a self that's subject to deterioration and instability? Or if that is the case, it is de facto not the self?
This is the way the self would have been understood within the Indian thought system in the Buddha's time. As I said, now when the Buddha is speaking in the when he's speaking in the ethical domain of discourse, he'll use the word self, referring to the person, the individual, not taking it in the metaphysical way as a persistent, permanent entity, but in the sense that we each have our own concrete personalities, our own individual identity. In that sense, the Buddha will use the word self affirmatively in order he'll use the word of self affirmatively as a spur to the sense of personal responsibility, moral responsibility, as a spur to personal effort to realize the goal of his teachings.
And the Pali word is the same in both cases?
It's the same word. It's the word atta, or there's the Sanskrit atma.
But, okay, so this is self as atman.
Yeah. But he's not using the word atman in the Upanishadic sense of the permanent, stable, unchanging.
So I guess what I'm saying, and pardon me if I'm belaboring the point, but who's to say that the self has to be persistent and permanent? Why can't it be impermanent and unstable and deteriorating, yet still a self?
One could use the word self in any way, sort of redefine it, but this was way the self was conceived within the thought world of the India during the Buddha's time. And I also say that at a deep psychological level, this is the way we conceive our own identity. Like we're always sort of grasping on things that we can take to be permanent or stable in the hope that this will preserve our personal identity.
Yeah, I guess my question is that realizing this obliterates the idea of a permanent, persistent self, for sure.
Yeah.
But does it obliterate that sense of self that's subject to impermanence and deterioration? That still remains.
You could say that the sense of self as one's own personal identity remains, but this is a purely empirical self. It's not the metaphysical Atma. Yeah. Okay, I said one question, but you just make your comment.
Yeah, quick thing. We had heard from Dhamma talks, see, there's a thing called concept. If you ask a small baby to draw a tree, a newborn baby cannot draw a tree because it's a concept. A tree is a concept. Now, lumberjack will cut the tree, make it wood, lumber, and the carpenter can make it a table, a chair, whatever. Then it breaks, they call it trash, set it on fire, it becomes ash. But all these are concepts. So similarly, the I, you, me, it becomes a concept because for convenience, when you say Bhikkhu, you know who it is. So it's just simple concept. At the bottom of it is probably all matter and energy. Yeah. And the karmic energy going from life to life is constantly changing, and therefore it is not called Atma.
Yeah.
This is my little understanding of it.
Yeah. Okay, I think we'll have to stop and do the sharing of the merits. You handed out the...
It's already distributed.
Okay, so we share the merits with the devas, and it's the deities, the bhutas, the fierce spirits, and the nagas, the dragon spirits, and with all other beings. Akasata chabhumata deva naga mahidika punyantang anubodhipa chirang rakantu sasanam. Akasata chabhumata deva naga mahidika punyantang anubodhipa chirang rakantu desanam. Akasata chabhumata deva naga mahidika punyantang anubodhipa chirang rakantu mankaram. Etavadacham hehi sampadam punya sampadam sabbe devanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Etavadacham hehi sampadam punya sampadam sabbe bhutanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Etavadacham hehi sampadam punya sampadam sabbe satanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Pavagupadaya vichitato etantare satakayupapanna rupya rupicha sanya samino dukha pamuchantu pusantu nibhuting. Okay, we stand and we'll do 3 half bows to the Buddha.
How to contemplate.